cultures, racism, and bias. Polyglots as multicultural educators. I am Janina Klimas. I've been teaching languages for more than 20 years on 3 different continents. I have a BA in theater arts and in foreign languages and an MA in the teaching of languages. Before I get into my talk, I wanted to share with you what an honor it is to be here. Every year that I've known about the Polyglot Conference, it's conflicted with my work commitments. I'm so heartbroken about everything that's going on in the world right now. And not to diminish what anyone's going through, but there are always silver linings. And for me, it's been being able to participate in this. I'm deeply grateful and honored to be here. And I can't wait to hear your talks and the ideas that so many of you are sharing. So thank you. I want to talk about racism, education, language, bias, and culture. This community is so open. We live and we breathe acceptance. Through languages, we seek out different perspectives. We seek out how to see things from other people's points of view. It's just part of who we are. I don't know if it's the chicken or the egg, and perhaps a bit of both. One thing that really surprises people when they get to know me is about my background. My parents come from 2 very different places and 2 very different backgrounds. They met at college when they were undergraduates in Boston. My father grew up in Boston. My family had immigrated to the United States from Lithuania. My first and my last name are Lithuanian. I've got blue eyes and I'm very fair. It always surprises people, when I share with people the other side of my family. This person, Benner Turner, was my grandfather. He was born in Georgia in 1905, and he was the grandson of slaves. His grandparents were born into slavery. I'm told that they actually had to give away all their children at one point because there was no way that they could provide for anyone but themselves. My great-grandfather was the eldest of these children. He was old enough to work, which of course means something very different in terms of age now than it meant then. So he was a teenager. He was able to get a job as a porter on the railroad, and he went back and forth between Atlanta and Washington, D.C. Apparently, he was very popular with the regular travelers. And a lot of these people who traveled frequently on this route knew him, and they would bring him books. He hadn't had any real formal schooling, but he could read very well, and he was very bright, I'm told. And as these people got to know him, they learned that there was this kid on his own living on a railroad, going back and forth between Atlanta and Washington, D.C., and they decided to sponsor him to go to Howard University in Washington, D.C., and he studied and became a doctor. And after he graduated, he moved back to Georgia. And his main mission was to treat African Americans. And he didn't make much money doing that. But he made a ton of money and apparently became wealthy because he was the best doctor around. A lot of white people who didn't want to be seen coming to him, they had embarrassing problems, things like illegitimate children or treating their illegitimate children. Basically anything that you didn't want anything to know about or you really knew that you needed to get something sorted would go to my grandfather. And they would pay him very handsomely. And he continued to practice medicine because he felt that it was his duty, but he made money by investing what he earned in several pharmacies. He was very well off, particularly for someone whose parents had been born slaves. And it was this man's dream to be able to take that money and do something about racism. And when the man that you're looking at right now was 12 years old, my great-grandfather took him to witness a lynching. And this was in Jim Crow South, where, of course, all laws were stacked against all black citizens after slavery ended. And we certainly see the effects of that with people being treated unfairly today. And unfortunately, in those days, people would go and watch these things. They would have picnics while people were being illegally hung. My great-grandfather told him that this is the reality that you're facing. And while it may seem very cruel to do this to a 12-year-old child, unless you want this type of thing to continue, you're going to have to do something about it, my grandfather was told. And this man I knew much later in his life, and I knew him very well until he died, was a very intelligent man. And when he was a child, he was living in Georgia, of course, where he came from, where he was born. There were no public schools for anyone after the 9th grade. And in the United States, it's about 14 years old, more or less. There were quite a few private schools, and while the family had the means to privately educate my grandfather, he wasn't allowed to even be considered in any of them because of his race. And my grandfather was sent to one of the most prestigious boarding schools in the United States, Phillips Andover Academy in Andover, Massachusetts. And I believe that is from his yearbook, that picture you're seeing right there. He graduated and got a degree from Harvard, and he stayed on at Harvard and got another degree from Harvard Law. He was fully intending to fulfill the investment that was made in him with all the privilege that he had to bring some justice into the world. He returned to Georgia. Imagine, from 14 years old, you live away from your parents. We didn't have FaceTime back then. You weren't calling home. You were probably writing letters and looking forward to the few that you got back. When my grandfather returned to Georgia with his 2 degrees from Harvard, he moved back in with his parents. And he took the bar to become an attorney in Georgia 3 different times and failed. Failed every time. A top student from an Ivy League university couldn't become a lawyer in Georgia. He suspected it was because of his race, but there was really no way to prove that. He moved to Philadelphia, where he easily passed the bar. And he practiced at a law firm there. When his father died, he wanted to go back south to his home to be able to look after his mother, who didn't have anyone. My grandfather was an only child. He didn't have any siblings. They moved to North Carolina, where he again passed the bar quite easily. He knew that in theory he could practice law, but the reality was not going to make it practical. He could have been the smartest, hardest working attorney with the best arguments, but there was no way he was going to be winning with white juries. He became a teacher and taught law at what's now North Carolina A&M University in Durham. While he was there, something was happening in South Carolina. A black student wanted to study law but was rejected from the state's only law school. It was taken to court, and their ruling was that the state of South Carolina had 3 options. 1, they could admit the student to the law school. 2, they could close the law school because that was unfair, because segregation was meant to give people separate but equal opportunities. Their actions were clearly against the law. Or 3, they could open a new law school. My grandfather went to work there as the dean of this law school. It was the first law school exclusively for black students in the United States, South Carolina State University of Law. Not long after that, he became president of this same university, which was an HBCU, a historically black college and university. I'm told that huge advances were made in the university during his tenure, but he was very unpopular. He was an autocrat, and he was mercurial. He was apparently extremely good at getting things done, and knowing him personally, I have no doubt that that was true. The university got accreditation, but my grandfather did a lot of this through working the segregation laws. He was very unpopular. He didn't feel that the campus was the place to protest during the civil rights movement. And of course, if you look back at history, that's exactly one of the biggest places that was happening. He thought that the best way for people to advance in their lives was to get an education, and that he would know how to work the segregation laws to get them the most that he could for the advancement of their schooling. He was really afraid of something called white flight. In the United States, many of our public schools are funded through local property taxes. Essentially, they're funded by the people that actually live in a specific area. And when the people move, the money moves with it. And he felt like the best good could be done through continued segregation. And I'm not here to agree or disagree. He was seen by a villain by a lot of people. And he's also been seen as a hero by some others afterwards. He served as president of this university during the civil rights movement. And frankly, during that time, people were very sick of his support of segregation. Throughout all of this, he was, of course, dealing with this himself. All the presidents of these HBCUs during this time had similar problems. They were really worried about the safety of the people on their campus, and they felt responsible for that. And they didn't want the protesting there for that very reason. Of course, this can be seen as blocking freedom of speech and not helping get rid of segregation. We know in the polyglot community it's about communicating and connecting and respecting each other and respecting our humanity, and that there's no place for segregation. But at that time, he didn't feel that that was realistic. My grandfather also had to travel a lot, and they weren't allowed to stay in hotels. And one silver lining for my grandfather in that situation was that he was able to build some really deep friendships with other presidents of HBCUs. So they would stay in each other's home. The woman in the front left is my grandmother, Julia, and my grandfather is the man behind her. And next to him was his best friend. And this best friend was one of his colleagues, also a graduate of South Carolina State, long before my grandfather was ever president, and that's Dr. Mays. Dr. Mays was Martin Luther King's mentor, and he actually gave his eulogy, I understand. Dr. Mays was very kind to my family. When my great-grandmother was later on in years and needed more looking after, he helped find an amazing group of people in place to take care of her. And I've been able to read a lot of the letters that they wrote to each other during the civil rights movement, trying to find the best way to navigate these really important moves forward and keep everyone safe at the same time. It's a totally different perspective than I would have imagined. There's no way to go back in the past and make life better for people or to take away any of the things that happened. I'm sharing this story with you today because it illustrates people who really dealt with, in their daily lives, combating racism and bias. And I know that many people do, and many people have throughout history in different times and in different places, but this is a story that's really personal to me. People who dealt with a lack of respect for their culture and for who they are as humans. And in the people that we're talking about right now, these Jim Crow laws that were set up to essentially work against equality led us where we are today. We've never in the United States fully healed from the past, and I think that's very evident in much of what we're seeing has gone on. There's so much work to do. I think that the polyglot community are leaders, whether they recognize it or not. I also want to say that I fully recognize that there's a lot of privilege in my family that I just told you about, and I carry a lot of guilt because of it. And I think to myself, why do I live this life when I know that people I share DNA with have had a very different experience in life? The burdens that I carry are emotional, and they're things that are out of my control. But the one thing that is in my control is learning and teaching languages and spreading the word that intercultural understanding develops deep mutual respect. Polyglots are multicultural educators. And right now I can't imagine a time in history where languages were more needed. Cultures are defined by ACTFL as the products, the practices, and the perspectives of the people that speak a language. The polyglot community lives that. You teach understanding. You teach how to see life and the world through lenses that are different from yours, from the one that you were raised in. And that's just through your example, through what you're interested in, why you're here today. Languages and cultures are inextricably intertwined. They're completely linked. And I do realize that I'm preaching to the choir here, but I wanted to pull out a few examples. So I think one of the very first things, if you're learning Spanish, that you'll learn are all the different ways to say you, which I haven't even listed here. But the big one, tú eres usted. So we learn that there's a difference very quickly. And we also learn how important it is to know the basic different ways of saying you, just to be able to communicate with somebody on the most basic level. we learn that, of course, vosotros is only used in Spain, and then we have to learn all these different verb forms, and it can be really challenging. But then we go deeper as you really, really learn Spanish and have a lot of contact with Spanish-speaking people, that tú is very common in Spain, and you could even perhaps offend somebody by using usted. It might be perceived as a bit cold. Whereas you go to some countries in Latin America, and it's extremely important. So there's one, really practical example out of the infinite number that are out there of, of language and culture being completely intertwined. Another one, this word, when I learned it, really kind of shocked me. Yogyo in Korean. So a very useful, basic word, great to know here. The first time I went to a restaurant in Seoul, having to shout that out and to get the attention of someone who's working at the restaurant was shocking to me. It felt really uncomfortable. As an English speaker, it felt really rude, but it's perfectly acceptable there. So again, language and culture being completely intertwined. So using here, come over here in a restaurant in an English-speaking world would not be received very well, but that's perfectly acceptable and expected in Korean. And then I have these examples of our, Japanese honorifics, and we all, san is the first one that we tend to learn. But knowing these things and having to understand these cultural parts as we learn a language. This is a whole presentation, of course, and if any of you are ever going to do any of those or write a blog post on this topic, I would love to know about it. A whole corpus of examples from different languages of how language and culture are completely linked. Some of the really obvious ones are foods, technology. So much of it comes from English, and we see that going into all these other languages around the world and become part of the words in Korean, for example. Words that talk about technology are pretty standard, like English. It's very interesting. I think that understanding what other people have gone through helps prevent bias and the mistreatment of others. Again, we can't change the past, but with all the work that you do with your blog posts, with your Instagram lives, with your YouTube, with your podcast, your books, and any content that you create that helps people communicate and understand people from other cultures is so important. You are a multicultural educator. Every time you learn a new word in a new language, you lead the world in being a less biased and more accepting place. So many of you ended up here today, perhaps out of necessity. Maybe you became multilingual or bilingual because you needed to. You moved as a child or you moved as an adult. Some people had a passion for another particular culture or a passion for other cultures in general, and that led them here today. Or a passion for travel and knowing the power that languages have in transforming your trip led you here today. Or maybe you got into languages because you loved reading and math and all the learning of patterns that you get to experience when you're learning a new language. I personally really loved that. But regardless of the reason, however you got here today, the center of all languages are people and connections, communicating and connecting with other people. And what all those codes mean, what all that problem solving means, brings us to that very fundamental cause. It's all geared towards being able to communicate, to really understand others who speak other languages. The work that you do connects all of us. I wanted to share my story today because I feel like there are so many more intentional ways that we can encourage people in our community, of course, outside of our community, to learn more than one language, as well as support some big groups that are doing some amazing things to promote multicultural understanding and, along with it, languages. Last October, I had the opportunity to attend a seminar for teachers at the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam. It was such a privilege. The first day we met with someone from the Anti-Defamation League in New York. We talked a lot about bias and identity. And I have this picture here of an iceberg representing, of course, the cultural iceberg. We did a lot of work with that. And I think it's a really interesting visual because it forces you to take a deep look at cultures as well as take a look at cultures on the surface. So, the surface, you might find things like foods and very identifiable bits of a culture. And then underneath lie all the deeper parts. If you Google it, there are a lot of different versions of this, of course, with different takes on what you might find on surface culture as well as in deep culture. But I think it's a really great exercise because it really supports so much of the work that so many people do in our community, as well as the Anti-Defamation League, on anti-bias. I also think it's a really practical language activity. So finding those words in your target language for the surface and the deep culture can really help you learn a lot about the culture of your target language, as well as a really practical, fun way to learn vocabulary. As a language teacher, one of the reasons I've learned multiple languages has been out of necessity, living abroad. But it's also given me a way to look at things through the lens of learners and find things that I find enjoyable. And this is one of those activities. So getting to experience language through a more beginning lens has really been one of the big reasons that I've continued to learn languages, and I'll continue to do so. I think it's really multi-layered. You can find some great example of what words people would put on the surface, and I think you could also have a great independent language learning exercise doing that. We also talked a lot about names and identity, and names are so personal to us, and whether those are the names that we were given or the names we chose maybe later in life. I think it's really deep and important work. And one of the takeaways that I have are that some really great practical language learning activities can be really deep and meaningful as well. So thinking about surface culture, foods, and then deep culture might be more identity and how people raise children. It gives us such a great way to dive really deep into languages. And those deeper activities like reading novels and literature from our target language really helps us connect with our target language culture. And we know that's research-based. Krashen did a study of 2 hyperpolyglots, and one of the subjects of his study had never lived outside of his native Budapest and spoke at least 10 languages, and he did it all through pleasure reading. So it's certainly, we know how valuable it is, but I think it's just another way to do that. All that literature really gives us an eye into the culture, especially when we can't travel. At the Anne Frank House, another experience that we had was learning about all the work that they do with schools. So right now, of course, they're not traveling, but you can contact their education department. They're very responsive. I think I didn't leave the address, but you can just Google Anne Frank House, and they travel all over the world working with teachers and students to educate on Anne Frank and her story, but they also do a great deal of work with refugees, and they have a lot of interns working, and they have this amazing community of people that does all of this amazing work, and they really want to do this work in schools. So you will be able to connect with some very knowledgeable people who will work hands-on and they will help connect you with a lot of amazing work that's going on. One of the projects that they do is the memory walk, and I thought this was super impressive. This memory walk is essentially a group of young students secondary would do some research to include interviewing about their city, where they live, and the monuments that are there or close to it. And this would be very interesting in outside of Europe. The projects that I saw were done in Europe, but I think this could be done anywhere. It just have to be a little bit different. And they do a video tour. And I've seen students do this as a foreign language activity. I saw an American student in Germany who did a memory walk all in German about his town, as talking about all the research that they found during the first phase of the project. I think this would be a great independent language learning activity as well. I love recording myself, and I do a lot of that work with students because I think it serves as a really great documentation of progress. But apart from that, even if you hate it or the people that are with you hate it, it really helps you work through a lot of shyness and mistakes. And if it makes you really nervous, you could even write a script. And that in itself is a really powerful activity for getting up into that intermediate level, right? Really planning things out. So this is an amazing group of people that do a lot of work educating about the past so it doesn't happen again, but they're also heavily involved in a lot of issues that are going on with regard to human rights, refugees. Really amazing, and they're very responsive. I wish I had known about them a long time ago. And of course they have their bookstore, and I was dumbfounded at the range of books, not just the diary they had, in so many different languages. And of course, you can get all of this online, and it supports the work that they do in the museum and in the house, but furthermore in all the work that they want to do with people learning. Their education program is very strong, as I said, and they really want to work with people. Lastly, I wanted to tell you about a project that I stumbled upon this summer from this excellent article that I read. I actually contacted the author, Dr. Tamara Walker, and she's a professor in Toronto. She grew up in the United States. She teaches history in Toronto, and traveling abroad and learning languages was completely transformative to her. She studied in Mexico, and I believe she eventually did a doctoral degree focusing on slavery in Latin America. She also studied in Argentina as well as Paris, I believe. Amazing woman. And this experience was completely transformative to her. And since she's been teaching, she started a foundation called The Wandering Scholar. And this is their Instagram page that you see right here. It's a foundation that makes travel accessible to youth from underrepresented backgrounds. And these students do a project abroad. For example, there was one student who was really interested in fashion, and they do quite a bit of research before they go to a country where they do this project in abroad. It's generally in a non-English speaking country, but English speaking countries are open as well, and they do a hands-on project. So please visit their Instagram page. They have some great stories from students who've participated. And I think when it comes down to it, as exciting as it is to take your first trip to Paris or somewhere that you've dreamed about for what felt like forever, and you know you're going to be away for a while, it's going to be really scary regardless of how excited you are. And if you recall, that can be really scary. having the support of people who've done this already can make a huge difference. And she has a podcast. It's called Why We Wander. And I think she has a link there that you can find, or a hashtag, which is all about traveling. So she's supporting young people who've never, been far away from home. And I just wanted to tell you about that project so you can, for your awareness and to learn about the amazing work that she's doing. And I wanted to leave some places that we can connect. I'm on Pinterest, Real Life Lang, and I'm on Instagram, Janina at Real Life Language, and I'm also hello at Real Life Language. And I want to thank you so much for allowing me to share my very personal story of languages and cultures and why multicultural education is so important to me. I also want to thank you for what you're doing every day. Every word you learn, every time you talk to somebody in another language, everything that you're doing in another language helps promote this cause. So thank you so much. And again, it was truly an honor to be able to talk to you today. Thank you. Goodbye.